I'm Connie Todd. I'm the curator of the Southwestern Writers Collection, and I would like to welcome you all to a kind of happy coincidence, a wonderful confluence of writers who have come here from different parts of the country, and we're all very lucky to be here too. We're filming this evening, so the film itself will become a part of our archives, and so the evening will be available to subsequent generations when they come here to look at the archives of Celia Morris and Beverly Lowry. We have their major archives here at the collection, and when they read about Benjamin Saenz, we'll have some footage. So you all are being filmed for posterity. I'd like to introduce Steve Davis, who's the assistant curator for the Southwestern Writers Collection. He's going to moderate the panel tonight and introduce our writers, and welcome to the evening.
Thanks, Connie. We had originally scheduled to have somebody else here to be the moderator. That's a guy named Cormac McCarthy, but we ended up having a conflict with his schedule, so I hope you're not too disappointed that it's me instead of Cormac. So we'll just do the best we can. And this courage at the typewriter, I had a few friends call and laugh. What the hell do you mean, courage at the typewriter? And they were imagining things like writers springing up from their desks to go save a kitten from a burning building and things like that. And of course, you intelligent, sophisticated people here realize that we're talking about an entirely different type of courage. And this is as it relates to writing. There are really two different kinds of writings, I guess, if you want to classify things in this way. There's the writing that sort of conforms to everybody's expectations. It's very easy to do, and you just tell people what they want to hear. And unfortunately, we see way too much of that in our society. And then there's a different kind of writing that's more ambitious, and it's the kind of writing that challenges people's assumptions. And needless to say, the three terrific writers we have assembled here are excellent examples of that. Here's how Celia Morris described this kind of writing. She wrote, and this is a quote, "Unless we tell our hard truths to one another, unless we pass along these lessons for which we have paid so dearly, the ground we gained will be lost, and generations to come will repeat the grim cycle," end quote. And that's a pretty important part of what this writing is about. And working here at the Writers Collection, we get to dig into the writers' archives, which is always a lot of fun. It's nice to see the manuscripts and how you can sort of trace the arc of a work's journey, and also in correspondence and journals, and see the influences that formed people's work. And one of the great archives we have here I just want to talk about for a moment is from Larry L. King, who, by the way, is a friend of Celia's. And I always thought of King as a really kind of a touchstone in terms of writer's courage. Larry King went into writing from politics, where he worked as the chief of staff for Congressman Jim Wright. And King fancied himself as being very progressive in race relations. He was responsible for hiring the first black staffer for a Texas congressional delegation in the 50s. He made a point of inviting black friends to his home in D.C. for parties, to the outrage of his white neighbors. He attended Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, and King felt very comfortable being kind of a gringo amigo in that way. And after the assassination of Martin Luther King, with the rise of the black separatist movement, Larry King felt very alienated from this new generation of blacks who were very hostile to him, and refused to give him a chance to prove that he was a good guy. And at the time, he was a star writer for Harper's Magazine, which was edited, coincidentally enough, by Celia's ex-husband, Willie Morris. And when King complained to Willie Morris about, the black people are just kind of being mean to him for no good reason, but not recognizing all the good things he's done for them, Willie suggested that he write an essay about it. And so here's kind of what King did. He sat down to write this essay about how it hurts to be whitey now, and he doesn't deserve that kind of treatment. And here's what King ended up saying about this. "I realized I was writing and thinking pure white man's bullshit. I belatedly realized that I held the same attitudes that far too many white people harbor. And as a result, there evolved an article and then a book with almost the exact opposite viewpoint that I had originally intended to reflect. This was certainly the most basic and important discovery I have made about myself in 41 years of living, and it was made at the typewriter by a man stumbling and feeling his way, I sat down to write a lie, and the truth got in the way. And that was the genesis of King's book, Confessions of a White Racist, which was nominated for a National Book Award, and is certainly one of his best books. And tonight, this courage topic is really, it's part of the university's common experience, but more importantly, it's just a good excuse to bring these writers here on campus to talk about their work. They're each very modest, and they prefer not to talk about their personal courage. They like to talk about the courage of their subjects and their works. But we'll try to draw a few things out of them while we're here. First we have, I want to introduce Beverly Lowry. She grew up in the literary town of Greenville, Mississippi, a place that Shelby Foote and Walker Percy also claimed as their home. Beverly had said, "From the time I was in elementary school, I always knew it was not only respectable to be a writer, but honorable, desirable. The literary tradition of Greenville is strong, and who our next writer would be was always pondered. Teachers were on the lookout." And of course, Beverly did turn out to be that next writer from Greenville. And fortunately for us here in Texas, she's lived here long enough for us to claim her as a Texas writer as well. Thank you, Beverly.
Thank you.
Many of you know that Beverly has lived here in San Marcos for several years. She's the author of several highly acclaimed novels, which I will show you. Daddy's Girl, Emma Blue, Breaking Gentle, Come Back, Lolly Ray, The Perfect Sonia, and The Track of Real Desires. In recent years, Beverly's turned to nonfiction. She directs the creative nonfiction writing program at George Mason University. And she's the author of this highly acclaimed memoir, Crossed Over. This is a story about her friendship with death row inmate Carla Faye Tucker. And Beverly's most recent book is Her Dream of Dreams, and this is a biography of the first African-American woman millionaire, Madam C.J. Walker. So quite an impressive list. Of this biography of Madam C.J. Walker, the New York Times called it a riveting, wrenching drama that offers a fascinating look at the black world of the late 19th century. And Beverly's won too many awards for me to list here. We don't have all evening. And next up for her is a biography of Harriet Tubman, which is due out in a little bit over a year. And Celia Morris is a noted historian and a literary scholar. And this is how I first became acquainted with Celia's work. This is a collection of critical essays on Texas literature. And this is one of those things that oddballs tend to buy and read. And you'll notice on the cover, there are all these male writers, and then here, kind of surrounded by them, is this woman, and this is Celia. She published an amazing essay in here that took on the masculine myth in Texas letters that she had first offered to Texas Monthly, and they declined it for whatever reason.
It's called Requiem for a Texas Lady.
And what was one of the many fascinating things in this essay, but one of the most fascinating for me, is that she took on her good friend, Larry L. King. Celia and I were joking earlier that she's kind of she could have made a career just telling people hard truths that they need to know. And she told King one here. She said many things about him, but sort of the kernel of it is this. She wrote, "The important fact is that a writer so gifted, so experienced, so ambitious, and so primarily identified with Texas neither sees women nor describes a social world in which they matter." And Larry was a little pissed off about that for a while, I guess.
For years. Years.
But the funny thing is, I interviewed Larry for my own book that I was working on from the archives here, and I asked him, because I'd realized that his later work did include a lot of major female characters, and I asked, did what Celia write about you have anything to do with that transformation? And he kind of went, I guess so. So. Celia's also written this amazing book on Fanny Wright. I don't know, have any of you ever heard of Fanny Wright? 19th century revolutionary, basically. Celia's going to talk a little bit about Fanny, we hope. Critics call this book unfailingly intelligent, lively, readable, brilliant, and passionate. It also won the Texas Institute of Letters Award for the Best Nonfiction Book of the Year. Celia has also written several other highly praised books, including Storming the State House, Running for Governor with Dianne Feinstein and Ann Richards, and also Bearing Witness, Sexual Harassment and Beyond, Every Woman's Story. And despite these many triumphs, in some ways Celia's most important story is the one that she tells about herself. This is from Finding Celia's Place. She grew up in Houston, attended University of Texas in the 1950s, and was named the university's sweetheart. She had a storybook wedding to Willie Morris, the writer and editor, later divorced him, and she was also married to Congressman Bob Eckert, another liberal folk hero that she also became divorced from. And in Finding Celia's Place, she describes what it was like for a woman to come of age during a time when women were basically defined by their marriages. And she writes that it was the shattering invisibility of women in a man's world. And she found in her marriages that the stronger I got, the worse my marriage became. And her path to independence and ultimately liberation was not an easy road, but it was ultimately successful. And this memoir speaks for an entire generation of American women. It's a great book. So, and all these books I'm showing, I think, are all on sale over there too, so keep that in mind. And I hope we haven't run out of time for the evening, have we? I'll try to move along. I'm sorry.
That goes in there.
Oh, thanks. We also have Benjamin Alire Saenz, who was born in a small farming community outside of Las Cruces, New Mexico, just upriver from El Paso. Ben studied theology in Belgium and became an ordained Catholic priest for a few years, and then he quit. And he likes to tell interviewers that he quit because the robes were too heavy. That may be all we get out of him tonight.
It's like not answering the question.
A little sassy.
Ben turned to writing, and he won a prestigious Wallace Stegner Writing Fellowship at Stanford, got his MFA in creative writing from the University of Texas, El Paso, where he teaches today. His first collection of poetry, Calendar of Dust, which we may have here somewhere. Here it is. This received an American Book Award in 1991. Second collection of poems, Dark and Perfect Angels, won the Southwest Book Award. These are beautiful titles, aren't they? Dark and Perfect Angels. His third book of poems, Elegies in Blue, was nominated for an LA Times Book Prize. Ben's first book of fiction, a collection of short stories, Flowers for the Broken, is also here. And his first novel, Carry Me Like Water, was published in 1995. That received a Southwest Book Award also. His second novel, The House of Forgetting, came out in 1997. Two bilingual children's books, one of which won the Texas Institute of Letters Award, are both on our exhibit. They're in our exhibit right now, the Tomas Rivera Award. And 2004, Ben published what is called a young adult novel, although I think it's a novel that any older adult can read profitably too.
It's a young adult novel for adults.
Maybe that's what it is. Sammy and Juliana in Hollywood. This novel was a finalist for the LA Times Book Prize. It won the America's Book Award, the Patterson Prize, named one of the top 10 young adult novels by the American Library Association, several other top 10 lists. Did pretty well. Ben's newest book, just out a couple of months ago, I guess, is In Perfect Light, published by HarperCollins. Now, this book, Publishers Weekly said, Saenz offers beautifully nuanced characterization, and he interweaves disparate needs and lives with a skillful, sensitive touch. It's really a beautiful novel. So, and those are our panelists. Thank you. And now on with the show. Beverly, you're writing a book on Harriet Tubman now. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us why you chose her as a subject?
You know, I'm going to answer a different question.
That's fine, too. Whatever makes you happy.
Why have I chosen to write about two African-American women, one after the other, when I am obviously a white woman? And it's to tell hard truths about ourselves, to borrow Celia's phrase. I think we have to learn the hard truths about ourselves in relation to people who are other than ourselves, whether it means another gender, another race, another part of the country, or another country. I grew up in a town in which I was the minority race. And so the African-American people and who they are and what they've suffered has been a part of my life from day one. And when I think back of what our life was, everything had to do with race. It really was like the bottom of everything we were and everything we did and everything we were taught to believe. And so it's, in a way, it doesn't surprise me that I've done this. I've been through a lot of times thinking it was kind of stupid to take on such a daunting project. Not just writing about somebody of a different race, but first of all, writing a biography, which I've not been trained to do and didn't really have any experience in. I was asked to write the biography of Madam C.J. Walker, and the person who asked me to do it was in the family of, well, it's a complicated story, but she was in a family connected to Madam Walker. In time, we decided not to work together, but at that point, I'd become so fascinated by this woman that I couldn't let go. And whatever anybody said or whoever thought I was doing the wrong thing kind of became beside the point to me. After I'd done a lot of research for the Walker book, I did a lot of research for the book. I began way before the beginning of her life. So I'd done a lot of work on the abolitionist era and slavery, and I was also asked if I would write a biography of Harriet Tubman, and this was an editor who's African American herself, and Harriet Tubman was her hero, very purely and simply, and she's a very fine editor at Doubleday. And I thought, I was still working on the Walker book at that time, and at first I wasn't sure I wanted to do it, but I didn't know how you could turn it down. It's just, to write the story of a true American hero, and when somebody wants you to do it, it would seem churlish not to, or foolish. But the kind of thinking that Steve talked about, that Larry King talked about, for instance, one of the things that to face up to when you're writing a book about somebody who was enslaved is language. It was very simple then because she was a slave and her master was her master. But when we look at it, he wasn't her master. He owned a lot of property, and he considered the people who lived on his place his property. And so you have to sit and look at that, and how do you deal with the terminologies, and how do you come to terms with this? I felt it was important to use the terms that were used then, to explain that that's what you were doing, but the only way to understand what her life was like is to understand how those terms were used, and that they were real and legal and binding and without negotiation. So I don't know if that's exactly courage or not. I think there are a lot, I think the people I've written about have shown a lot more courage than I have in writing about them. So I don't think I'm modest particularly, as Steve, thank you very much. But I just think if we're talking about courage, they're far more courageous than I am.
Celia, can you talk a bit about Fanny Wright and your biography?
I'd love to talk about Fanny Wright, and I've been disappointed because my book was published in 1984, and I thought at last Fanny is going to be back in the place she belongs in American history. But there have been 2 or 3 large books about lots of women in American history that have come out in the last few years that haven't mentioned her, and it just breaks my heart. And I was talking to a historian at the University of Texas the other day, and he has published some very important books, and he said, historians now, particularly if they're in American studies, are really writing about present times, and so you mustn't take it personally, and I just keep hoping that she will have her due. She was born in Scotland, brought up in in England and came to this country in 1817 when she was 23 and spent about half her adult life here. She was the first woman in America to act publicly against slavery. She was the first woman to speak in public. She was the first woman to say that women were men's equals and they ought to act like it and be treated like it in all the business of public life. She was involved in the beginnings of the labor movement. But she became so controversial. To be called a Fanny Wrightist in the 1830s was roughly equivalent to being called a communist in the 1950s. But I was attacked once by a woman historian for presentism. This was at an American Studies conference. And I didn't know, I have a PhD in English, and I don't know the jargon of the history profession. And so somebody explained to me that that meant that I was imposing the standards of our time on her. And I said, you know, I didn't make Fanny Wright into a feminist. Fanny Wright made me into a feminist. In the course of writing this book, which I was so blessed to be able to do, obviously it really changed my life, I found out about things that I had no idea about. I grew up in Houston, went to the University of Texas. I had a grandmother who, according to my uncle, learned to knit while riding horseback herding 1,000 sheep. You know, you just don't think of women as inferior creatures if you have that kind of heritage, and a lot of us do. A lot of us had grandmothers who were like that. She survived the 1900 storm in Galveston, and and my other grandmother was also a very, very strong person. But that was a certain period in history, and when things got more urban and the economy changed, people who had been absolutely indispensable when they lived on the frontier were put into a different kind of situation when they were married and blah, blah, blah. So I started finding out what had happened to women in American history, how hard they had to fight. Fanny preceded Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, who all, by the way, really quite respected her, but they all had the sense not to go out and talk about how much they respected her, and because they were more politically astute than she. But when you read the kinds of things she said about just the fact that women were as capable as men, and if they were not educated, the children would not be educated. And to think of that as scandalous is to really start coming to terms with the ways people have, ways women have been unfairly treated and unfairly used in the United States. And the essay that I wrote, Requiem for a Texas Lady, I did in the first place for to do the keynote address for the first Texas Women Scholars Conference. And I decided, for reasons I can't remember anymore, to look, in order to give this speech, to look at the fiction of the men who were my peers, my friends often, who were my age, guys who were writing fiction, because they were writing about the world that we had shared. And I wanted to know how women came off in these books. And Larry was the one who was my closest friend. Bill Brammer had been a very close friend. McMurtry I've met. He's a good friend of Beverly's. But and I discovered that, with the exception of McMurtry, that most of them, the women in their books, were fantasies. They were projections of male fantasy. And I said about Larry, and I ended up writing this paragraph and then calling Larry and reading it to him, and he laughed with a very angry back note in his voice. I said, you know, he's written about Louis Armstrong, he's written about his father, he's written about LBJ, he's written, you know, all about this stuff. But he can't write about women, and if you you can say about him, as John J. Chapman said about Emerson, a visitor from Mars can learn from the worst Italian opera what you cannot learn from the works of Emerson or Larry King, that there are two sexes. Larry subsequently wrote Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, and I thought, you know, Larry, this is when he was still really mad at me, so I didn't ever get to ask him this. I thought, you know, Larry, that's not what I had in mind. But then he did start. He really did. And unfortunately, this essay was published after I had written the editor saying, could we maybe change that? Because Larry's trying hard, you know, and it was too late. And fortunately, when Steve asked me if I would give my papers here, which was very flattering and wonderful for me, and I'm terribly proud that they're here, I came across a letter the letter I had written to that editor, and I sent it to Larry, and Larry sent it to him because he was doing this book, and so there is this acknowledgement that Larry really did respond to this criticism, which I think was terrific. I mean, that is the way we learn. And all of us who write, certainly all of us who write nonfiction, I don't know what it is like for fiction, but we need other people to tell us the truth, because somebody's going to tell us sometime. And it's very important to listen to somebody who cares about us and will say it. And I think that's probably enough for me at the moment.
Okay, we'll come back to you. Ben, with your latest novel, when we corresponded by email and talked about this panel, you said this sounds like a great idea, and because the topic really applies to your book. And I was wondering if you could talk about how your characters in the novel are called on to use courage.
Well, I think that one of the things that I always write about as people in turmoil, I think that one of the reasons I write is that I'm really drawn to, I admire people immensely. I like to watch them. People think I'm very much an extrovert, which I am, but there's another side of me that's very much an introvert, and I like to watch people, and I think that people go through a lot of struggles. When I don't like someone, I tend not to like people who have all the answers, because I don't see their struggle. I don't sense their struggle. I tend to be drawn to people who are, you know, they want to be good. I think people want to be really decent people, but they don't always succeed. I don't always succeed. And so that I like to put my characters in these situations where they're really tested, and I think all my novels are about that. They are, in one sense, plays in a certain level, because I think that's what plays do. They have these dramatic moments, and then they play themselves out, and you see the characters trying to work themselves out of these moral situations, and sometimes those situations are in you know, traditional tragedies, they're of their own making, but in life that's simply not true. I mean, all our lives are not of our own making, and it isn't true that some people are victims. They are. They just are. My 13-year-old niece was killed, was murdered when she was 13 years old. Some men walked into a bowling alley and they literally killed everybody in that room. Those people were victims. They were. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that's a lot of what life is. I don't think, this whole idea of Victorian coincidence, life is coincidence. I met my wife, I almost didn't meet her again. I met her when I was 16. We were both at a funeral of an old friend, and I hadn't seen her in 20 years, and I ran into her, and I married her. Well, guess what? That's coincidence. I might have not gone to the funeral. She might not have gone to the funeral, but we both went to the funeral. And thank God she likes men with mustaches. But so I think that I don't think that that's just a literary device. I don't. I think that life is made of coincidences. That's what accidents are, and they happen every day. And how many millions of people are killed in accidents every day? That's part of life. We can't just take it out of the equation. And so in my work, it's part of the equation. I think that, and so in this particular novel, it's about a very damaged young man, and the novel is, we discover why he's damaged. That is the trajectory of the novel. He is a young man who is damaged because he has been used as a prostitute when he was a boy in Juarez, and we find all that out. So at first he's just this angry young man. Oh, why is this guy so angry? And then we get to a point where we understand that, but I don't think I'd leave it there. I do think part of courage is overcoming our rage, but I think the part of courage is acknowledging our rage. What is the appropriate response to a lot of things that happen in this world? Well, the question isn't, why aren't we madder? Why aren't we more enraged? That's the question. That shouldn't then mean that we become uncivilized people. And so I think I write about, I always think that in my young adult novel, my young adult novel for adults, someone asked me, "Are you Sammy?" And I say, "No, I'm not Sammy. Sammy's my main character. Sammy's who I wanted to be." I think my characters are always much more virtuous than I am. They always know what to say. They say smart things. They suffer deeply and with grace, and they're articulate about it. They're usually better looking than me. All of those things, but I think that I want to write about people's pain. People are in, and I think pain is very real, and I think that that's the test of a human being. Some people turn away from their pain, and some people are destroyed by it, or some people fall in love with it. I'm not in love with pain. It just happens to be a part of life, and I think courage is found is how you overcome that, how you find. In my novel, one of the other main characters is a therapist who counsels Andres Segovia, who is the damaged artist in my novel. And her name is Grace. And she is a woman who becomes her name. She is also in a lot of pain. And I think for me, writing isn't about courage. I don't think. I think I think my characters are about courage. I think writing is about discipline. I think basically my poetry is more about me and my life and my politics. And if there is anything courageous about what I do is one thing is that I was told in writing workshops to leave my politics behind, please. You are supposed to be writing a good story. And actually, if you'll pardon my French, my internal response was, fuck you. I have to be a good enough writer to wed my politics to my aesthetic, not to take the hard part out. There is such a thing as a bad political poem. There is also such a thing as the discipline to write a good one. There is such a thing as a bad love poem. I've read many from my students, believe me. But to have the discipline to write a good one, I think that's where, for me, is that I refuse to leave. I'm 51 years old. I'm not old, but I'm not a child anymore. It has taken me a long time to arrive at a politics I can live with and embrace. And I am not going to leave that behind just for the sake of publishing a novel at HarperCollins. So I do think that there is such a thing as in writing as having courage, but I do think that how we do that is having the discipline to make it art in our work.
I thought we might get around to politics at one point during the evening, and Celia, I wanted to ask you about this because one of the interesting things about your book on Fanny Wright is that as extraordinary as Fanny was, she was at least 150 years ahead of her time in certain ways. She was very much an egalitarian, and started a commune to teach slaves that she was having freed to learn to live independent lives. She spoke about the primacy of sexual pleasure even outside of marriage. And again, this is in the 1820s.
She did not have a lot of political sense. I said Robert Owen was said to have a blank where his political sense should have been, and Fanny had a vacuum.
Yeah, and she talked about the church as being, or religion as being a perversion of the human spirit and things like that.
She did.
And one of the things that I enjoyed about reading your biography is that you weren't afraid to be critical of Fanny and the ways that you saw, and maybe it was presentism, I don't know, but you had this subject who really is very heroic in many ways, and yet you challenged her, and that made me think of the parallels between Fanny and your ex-husbands, and that these are very prominent liberal folk heroes who had these kind of private issues that you called them on.
How long do I get to have to answer this question?
And so, I've always been fascinated by this question, how these very progressive public figures can be, I don't hate to say wretched, but so
Go ahead.
miserable in their own
Be my guest.
lives with the people they're closest to. I mean, can you talk about that?
Well, Fanny, it's very interesting. When we were in the process of thinking about this panel, and Steve said courage, and I thought he, of course, meant the people we were writing about. In a way, I thought Fanny is not she was very brave, but in a sense, she didn't quite know what she was doing. So there is a degree to which I wouldn't call her the ultimate heroine, because she was British, and she didn't understand how many people she was going to royally piss off or terrify. She was almost 6 feet tall. She had a voice so strong that she could be heard in an audience of 3,000 without, obviously, the use of modern acoustical devices. She was very radical, and had she was better educated than most men of her class in Britain. She was very, very intimidating. But she didn't quite understand that, because she really was genuine in her desire to help people find a better world to live in. And she wanted to be great in the best sense of that word. And I think that was really very honorable. I then wrote a book that came out of the Hill-Thomas hearings, which is called Bearing Witness, and I went back a couple of days ago and reread some of these interviews. I went around the country listening to women tell stories that range from verbal sexual harassment to incest. And these were, for the most part, women I do think were heroes and really courageous, because they did know pretty much in every instance what powers they were taking on. And I listened to about 150 women in the course of a year and a half. And there were only 2 or 3 that I thought, this is hokey. This is really, I don't believe this story. This is a woman who was trying to get out of a bad marriage, and she thought having an affair with her boss would be a nifty idea and would help her do it, or somebody was just flat out crazy. But the people who stood up in their work situations, usually, or sometimes there was a chapter on the home, people who were abused by their husbands or partners, and ultimately did something about it. That really took courage, because in the world that we grew up in, most of the people I see in this room, the world we grew up in, a woman's word was not taken to be entirely serious in cases of abuse. And that's changed a lot in the last 15 years, but it hasn't gone away. And so I thought, I've gotten courage in my own personal life by writing about people who were just heroines. I mean, there was one woman named Tammy Miller who worked really cleaning floors and doing a bunch of stuff like that in a plant in Indiana, and she was really a kind of Tom Sawyer person. She was always saying, that ain't right. And she was feisty, and she was not a very big woman, but she was really high-wired. And she'd take on all these jobs, and she'd sass these guys back, and she wasn't really appalled by people who dropped their pants or anything like that. She could deal with all that, and verbally she would give back whatever she got, but she just said, nobody can touch me. And she got into a situation where these guys got so inflamed by her, I mean, a bad rhythm got going, and these guys took hold of her, turned her over, and a man bit her on the ass so hard that she bled through her blue jeans. And she wanted the company to admit that this was awful. And the whole politics of everybody trying to get it quiet, say to her, go away. She ended up going up in a crane with a shortwave radio and taking a whole bunch of pills and saying to them, you don't know where I am, you're not going to find me. And they, practically all her systems were down. I mean, they barely saved her life. And she went on to successfully challenge this, and she wasn't in it for money or anything. I mean, they kept trying to give her money, and she said, no, I don't want, that. And, listening to people like this, in addition to, lawyers, fancy lawyers, and a woman who worked for the UN, the kinds of things that people do in their daily lives that take real guts. I remember one time I was at a memorial presentation a day long for Irving Howe, who was my PhD supervisor at the City University of New York. And there was a guy there who was a philosophy professor at either Princeton or Harvard. He's worked at both places. And he was talking about the sit-ins, and he referred to the pusillanimous Southern liberals. And I started raising my hand, and I said, nobody would call on me. And I went up to him at the at one of the intermissions or something, and I said, I really want to take exception to what you're talking about. He was trying to say that the people who did the sit-ins were these old radicals from New York and New England. And I said, do you have any idea how hard it is to act if you're living in a place against the ethos of most of the people in the place? He said, where are you from? And I said, Texas. And he said, oh, that's different. And I thought, shit. But it's those kinds of things, those people who fight against whatever is the prevalent. Rosa Parks, we just had this very moving ceremony in Washington. I was there with two friends from England. We walked all the way around the Capitol because I have gotten to the age that I know that I can't stand 5 hours in line to honor her. But we walked all the way around. It was so moving. And this was a woman who did something that was very quiet, and it changed the world we all live in. And I've had the great privilege of writing about Virginia Durr, who was the white woman who lived in Montgomery, Alabama, who said to Mrs. Parks, I know of a 2-week scholarship to, what's that wonderful place in Tennessee? Vanderbilt? The training center in Tennessee for radicals. I'll think of it in a minute. And you want to go? And she said, yeah, Highlander Folk School. And Virginia said to Mrs. Parks, do you want to go? And she said yes, and Virginia found her a suitcase and the money to go, and she came back, and her husband, Cliff Durr, got a call from the guy who's head of the NAACP 3 weeks later saying, Rosa Parks is in jail and they won't tell me why, and can you come and do something about it? So Virginia and her husband went down and bailed her out, and then, these were people, white people from the South, who had been completely shunned by their people. It's a wonderful story. And then, you know, 20 years later, when Virginia died, the having been completely shunned, the front page of the newspaper was entirely devoted to her, and they flew the flag at half-mast. And it wasn't what the tribute that Rosa Parks got, and probably didn't deserve to be, but it was wonderful. And it's those kinds of people that I just feel it's just been such a privilege to be able to write about them. And after you do that, then you don't want to be grungy in your own life.
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest here, writers really aren't that courageous compared to other people. I mean, let's just face it.
Let's just face it.
That's the conclusion we've come to here this evening. Thank you all. But I do want to ask Beverly, because reading Crossed Over, have any of you read Crossed Over? I'm sure you guys have. Jim is in it. This was a pretty tough book to write, and I was just wondering if you could talk about how hard it was to work on it.
For those of you who haven't read it, it is, as Steve said, about the friendship I developed with Carla Faye Tucker. Do you all know who she was? Yeah, she was executed by the state of Texas in 1998. First woman to be executed in the state since the Civil War. And, you know, I'm not going to sit here and say it doesn't take courage to do what we do. When Steve first said, friends said, what is this about courage at the typewriter? I thought they were saying typewriter. Who writes on a typewriter anymore? Because
it's a metaphor.
When I started thinking about this, I thought, when did I write on a typewriter, you know, and what courage was then, as opposed
That was courage,
to now.
typewriter.
It was, yeah. And my first typewriter, I'll just tell this one story. I won in high school. I won 2 contests, writing contests. One was a community fund essay writing contest, and they gave me a Smith Corona typewriter for that, which I ended up. My father commandeered it for a long time, the way he commandeered much of our lives, but I finally wrote my first book on that little portable typewriter. The other one was, and this I'm sure I wrote in pen, so this was courage at the tablet. It was, they used to have a contest in the country called, I think it was called I Speak for Democracy. Did anybody, this was a long time ago, I was probably about 16. And this was a national contest. I won it. And I want to tell you all, I haven't said this many times, I'm going to give you the first line of that essay. You ready?
Ready.
All right. I said, this is Beverly Faye, age 16, communists, fascists, beware. I speak with a voice that's free. Now, I was thinking about that, and I thought, I'm pretty sure I didn't know what a communist or a fascist was when I wrote that, but I wrote it, and I guess that's more bravado than courage. But anyway, to get back to Crossed Over, you know, this was a book that was written at an extremely hard time in my own life. My son was killed in a hit-and-run incident right out here, just past the, what are we in, Hays County? Yeah, the Hays County line. And I, out of just a sense of interest and probably a way to heal my own life and be passionate about something again, I became interested in Carla, who was then on death row in Gatesville. This was about 1987, and she had been in prison then for 6 years. And so I went to see her. And I wrote her and just managed to set up a meeting with her. It's in the book. And I went to see her. I stayed that day for 4 hours. At that point, if you went as press, which I did because she asked me to. And understand, I didn't have a press pass. I hadn't written any. I'd written a little bit of journalism, but not much. But I just went. That to me was out of, and a friend of mine who's a psychiatrist, I said, I didn't go as a writer because I didn't go to write a book. I didn't know why I went. I just went. And he said, no, but you went because you're a writer, which is probably true. But it was going back that took courage, I think, because to go one time is to sort of dip into somebody's life, leave and say, well, that's horrible. What she did was terrible. What's going to happen to her is terrible, and I can go on with my life. And the second visit, I almost didn't go because I knew that if I went again that I was committed and that I couldn't back out or be too busy or do anything else. And so I finally went. My ex-husband actually was the one who said to me, you can't not go. She's waiting for you. And I went, and I walked in, and she said, I washed my hair for you, which still breaks me up. And it just, for me to have thought about not going, it broke my heart, too, and it made me feel like it's a little cowardly to even have entertained the thought. But I was proud of myself for having done it. You know, whoever convinced me or sort of made me understand that I needed to go. I did go. And at the end of that visit, I said to her, I'm going to come see you at least once a month. And I committed to it at that point. And I felt like in some way I was making up for some other people I didn't come through for in some way. And that it was a way of healing my life in a way that I could not have articulated then and can't truly articulate now. But she meant a great deal to me, and I wanted to do right by her. I don't know, did any of you read the article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago about Steve Earle writing a play about Carla? Did you read it? Okay. I just want you all to know this because I'm a Steve Earle fan. I buy his records. I've been to concerts, and I knew he was writing a play about Carla. And you know, Robin McNeil has written a play about Carla. It just means her life is extended if other writing is done about her. So I was reading this article, and I got to the end, and it said, in his play, Carla goes to purgatory where she meets her victims. And he said, in her life, Carla didn't own up to what she did. And so Steve Earle is saying he's giving her that opportunity. Well, I fairly blew up. I went home and I wrote Steve Earle, the New York Times, the writer of the article, the arts and leisure person, and said who I was, and said Carla Faye faced what she did every day of her life. Her conversion was not just some trick so she could get to heaven. It wasn't just a personal thing of, oh God, forgive me, let me in. It was to try to atone for what she had done. And so what I saw is he was taking away the courage that she displayed. The other part of that story that I would like to have said something about, the actress who's playing Carla said she wanted to play her because she thought she was the epitome of the Southern woman. And I wanted to say, do you know the difference between a Southern woman and a Texas woman? Do you know the difference between a Houston woman and a Dallas woman? Do your work, girl. But I also wrote in that book about my son's death, and that I guess, you know, you face up to stuff. As Larry King says, you sit there and you look at it and you look at it and you try to figure it out. And you do the same in fiction, absolutely. I mean, this is what Ben said, and Celia questioned. You look at it and look at it and look at it and write it down and come back and say, that's not right. I don't believe that. You know, you test your own beliefs. You test your own political beliefs, emotional realities that you've come to, your psychic beliefs, whatever it is. Say something. I feel like you're taking a breath.
No, I think that's true. I just think that's true.
Okay.
I do.
Do you want to jump in, Ben?
I just think that one of the things that about, maybe that's the hard part about being a writer. Maybe I wouldn't frame it as courage, but it's the hard part about when you, after a while, if you've practiced the discipline of writing long enough, you can write a pretty sentence. You can. But that doesn't make it true. It makes it seductive. And in certain ways, I think writers do seduce people. Good ones always do. Great ones always do. But that doesn't mean that there's a moral force necessarily behind that seduction. There can be. And we always hope that it would be so. But it's not necessarily true. I always think of a poet friend of mine, Simone DiPiero, was a great poet at Stanford, would tell us in workshop when we brought in a poem, he would say, he was a tough guy from South Philly, had a kind of voice like a cement mixer thing going on, and he'd say, Ben, your poem, that line, it's a little in love with itself, don't you think? I was always so proud of a particular line in a poem. What he was saying is that your poem is working fine. It doesn't need that line. It would work better without it. And just because you can write something beautiful sometimes doesn't mean that it's necessary or true or real. And that's one thing that I think that I'd like to think I do is that I'd like, or I struggle to do, is that I want to, I really don't like writers. When I read something, I always, I don't, just because I buy a book in hardback doesn't mean I have to finish it. I won't. And sometimes I get the feeling that some writers, and more contemporary writers than writers of other generations, feel a little superior to their characters. And, I really feel that if a character is worth representing, then I want to represent that. I want the reader to believe, I know it's fiction, I know that, but I want the reader to imagine that this person has a life outside of the words that I wrote for them. And they start imagining an entire life that's not on the page. I think that, so that I want my characters to be real. I really, when I grew up, the writer du jour, the great writer to set up for someone of my generation was, of course, Ernest Hemingway, who couldn't write a woman to save his life. He couldn't, because his writing was about male angst and male stasis and male virility, and it really was, that was his subject. And so I really have struggled, and I really don't like that. I think that for me in my life, my mother saved my life. My mother saved my life. She did, and she saved all of our lives. And she, frankly, saved my father's life. I married the human being I most admire. She's a judge, family court judge. I've struggled to write women characters that are real, because I love and admire women, not just their bodies but their lives and their minds, and so I want that to be a part of my work, and that's difficult, I think, but I think that's part of what I do. I think that when we sit down to write, we do a lot of things, and for me, one of them one of the things that I have done through my writing is to also write always, unfortunately, about racism. Because I grew up in a racist world, and I grew up in a segregated world. When I went to Mesilla Park School in southern New Mexico, it was a small school. There was a gringo first grade and a Mexican first grade. And that's the way it was, a small school, but that's the way it was. And so sometimes if one of the little white kids was not too bright, they put him in with the Mexicans, and you got a little Mexican that was a little smarter, they put him in, with the white kids. And so that was our way of integrating. But I knew that was true. It was very true. And I felt very exiled for myself when in the 4th grade I got moved into the white classroom, because I wasn't with all my friends anymore. And that marked my life. And so I write about those issues always, because I think it's important for a writer to write about the material world he or she lives in. I don't write about everything. I write about the material world I live in, and I want to tell the truth about it, which is not to say that I don't have my blind spots. I do. But so did William Faulkner, and he was a great writer. And he wrote about the South. And what I love about his writing is that he did tell the truth about the South. Because when you read his work is about racism. And I think it's really interesting that people don't talk about it. But read Absalom. It's one of the great modernist work, why people like to talk about it formally. But read it. Oh my God, it's devastating. And that's what makes it beautiful for me. And I think that took courage for him to do that in his time. Wherever that came from, I love his work because of that. I think and all of the writers, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who built a career on really telling the truth to the Latin American world full of dictators, I love his work because he also writes about love and the body but the human body and the body politic. And somehow through his stories, you feel that we live in a better world and the Latin American world is a healthier body because he's written such beautiful work. And so that maybe those kinds of people are my all of the novels that I love are novels that I think have spoken the truth about society, from To Kill a Mockingbird, to Native Son, to The Grapes of Wrath, which I think is an incredible novel. I admire those works not just because they're beautifully written, but because they told me a hard truth. I think that was courageous of them. They told me a hard truth about the world and the America that I lived in.
That's wonderful. May I answer just a minute? Steve asked a question a while ago that I evaded, which was about writing about my ex-husbands. I'd like to tell you just in a few minutes about how I decided to write this last book, Finding Celia's Place. Just as we were turning 60, 5 of the women I had been very close to at the University of Texas met at Glide Memorial Church in San Francisco, and then we went to Green's Restaurant, which is a vegetarian restaurant overlooking the bay. And my sophomore roommate, Sydney, was telling this story about she had had 5 children, 2 sets of twins, and had married an architect, and they were living in this if I could remember the architect's name, you would recognize it. It's a fancy house in Marin County, which they really couldn't afford to live in. So here were these naked little children running around, and 15 years later, I was having dinner in Claremont, California, and I mentioned this, and this guy said, "I know who you're talking about." It was sort of the scandal of the neighborhood. The Grace Shipping Line lived on one side, and Lever Brothers lived on the other. But anyway, it was a sporting place, and I was doing a master's at Stanford, and I'd go over there a couple of of times, and I remember once trying to take, I was either opening the blinds or closing them, and the whole thing fell apart. But when she was in her middle 30s, Sydney found out that her husband was squandering a lot of money and running around on her. So she went down into the cellar of this house and found a bunch of screens, and she took the screens to a 40-acre plot of land they had in the Napa Valley and built a house and raised these children with no running water and no electricity. So Sydney is telling this story. We are all laughing so hard that the waitress doesn't bring the food for a long time because she doesn't want to spoil the fun. Everybody in the restaurant is turned staring at us, probably saying to their waiters, whatever they have, we want. I sat back and I looked at us and I thought, this is so amazing. Here we were, 5 incredibly privileged women. We were white women in a profoundly racist society, deeply segregated society. We had good public school educations by the standards of the day. We had enough money. We had superb health that we took for granted, of course. We all married men that we thought were going to live lives that we would be proud to share. And here we were, all these years later. We had between us 9 divorces, 14 children, more lovers than we could remember, much less would admit to. 2 of Madeline's having been women. We were all in better shape than we had ever been in our lives. We had all become professional women, but all of us had gone through what in biblical phrases, the valley of the shadow of death. And I thought, that's really a story. And I believe that in our adult lifetimes, the world for women has changed more than it had in the whole of history before. And we lived it in our emotional lives, and I wanted to tell that story. And in order to tell that story, I had to tell some truths that were very painful and very difficult. And I also did not want to take advantage, as it were, of people who didn't come into my life in order for me to tell their secrets. The people I was most concerned about were my 2 ex-husbands and my son. And at one point, Malcolm McGregor in El Paso, Texas, stole the book away from my closest friend in El Paso, to whom I had sent it, and called her the next day and said, my God, she's going to tell it all. But I didn't, of course, tell it all. But I had to tell enough because we ended up, life happened to us, and it wasn't what the story said it was going to be. And I had to write about all that. And for the most part, people responded well to that story. I was attacked, as I expected to be attacked, and one guy wrote to me that he loved my book, and he thought I'd be interested in knowing how he found out about it, and that he had been at Lamar High School in Houston the year after me and was at a New Year's Eve party, and this woman, they were talking something about our high school reunion. Our 50th high school reunion was going to be that next fall, and that I wasn't coming. And this woman said, no wonder she wrote that scandalous book. And he said, needless to say, I was very interested to know what that was about. So I went and said, why was it scandalous? And she said, well, she wrote about masturbation. And I thought, geez, I didn't even remember writing about that. And I thought of all the things somebody could be upset about that book. That was really, so anyway. I caused a few tremors, but those weren't the kinds that I was really worried about.
Okay, we have time for some questions from the audience before we adjourn to the book signing. Anybody? Yeah.
Sally?
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to say I was glad that you said that about the play, because we had talked to the Texas Moratorium Network about it, because talking to Steve Earle about how to benefit performance if we could, but we couldn't read it, and we hadn't seen it, and we couldn't talk to anyone who had gone to see it yet. And of course, I think it's inappropriate because even I remember just from on television, exactly what you're saying is so true. She obviously has dealt with it and dealt with it for years, and so thank you for.
You're welcome. It was one of those moments in which I could do nothing else, and it's an act of supreme arrogance, really, on his part, and it's very disappointing because, as I said, I'm a fan. Thank you.
Okay, other questions? Anybody? Yes?
Well, I'm not sure if it's going to be more question or comment, but I've been thinking a lot about why I write or why a person writes, and all I know so far is that I can't think of anything better for me to do. And for me, courageous means being, a courageous person changes other people, but they're also unafraid to be honest with themselves and to change themselves. And I went to a reading, and it was Jerry Brown from her book, and she said that a good poem, and I think this would apply to any piece of writing, is the one that changes the author by the time they're through with it. And before I had been thinking of it only as, well, a good piece of writing that I read changes me, but the fact that it would change the author as well, and that really is the clincher of what a good writer does. And I think courage would be for the writer to face that. I guess if you guys want to comment on that.
No, I just want to say you should be up here, I don't think any of us has said anything as moving or any more profound than what you just said. So I hope you keep writing.
Another kind of, I'm sorry, go ahead, Ollie.
No, I just had a comment. I'm trying to psych myself out to start writing. I have had a few articles published in the newspaper, and I myself love the true history. Every time I hear people talk about African American, it's always slaves. We did not all come here as slaves. We have contributed so much to these United States. In fact, a lot of us came in with some of the first settlers, and God scattered us all over the four corners of this earth. And we have had some mighty, powerful men and women in this African-American race that were not slaves. I'm trying to get away from this slave mentality. Let our children know the true history. Let the whole world know the true history of our history. And it was not all slaves.
Mm-hmm.
I just had that comment to make.
Thanks, Ollie.
No disagreement from here.
I'm so proud of. I'm proud of.
You should be.
I'm proud of my people. Sure, some of us came over here as slaves. And I'm proud of them. They
Right.
made bridges of their bodies for us to cross over to get to where we are
Right.
today. And I'm proud of them. Proud
Good.
of all of them. Okay.
Yes. Sorry. This is my watch. I'm sorry.
Well, I was encouraged a few years ago about writing a book about my life with epilepsy. And there's not much, well, there's a lot of information out there, but it's mostly by psychiatrists, psychologists who write about it. And so I finally got the courage and wrote about my life with epilepsy. So, and I'm hoping that, because I wanted to help a lot of other people. And my next book, they said, should be a children's book. So because of children, would sure would help a lot.
Good for you.
Anyway, it took about 7 years to get it done, but I finally got it done.
Congratulations.
That's great. Yes, Jim.
When Mr. Saenz was talking first about politics and writing, and then about racism, and when he mentioned Hemingway, I had to think about the short story called The Mexican, a boxing short story, in which politics is an essential ingredient. And it's not a very well-known short story, but I think it's excellent. And I would encourage you to use it in some of your classes if people question.
I'm teaching Hemingway next semester. I'll look it up.
Is that the one by, is it by Jack London, or is that?
No.
Oh, it's Jack London, you're
It
right.
is, okay.
I'm sorry, it's not Hemingway, it's London.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's a great little book, short story.
And one of the other examples of courage I wanted to mention before I let our writers escape is that, as Connie mentioned at the outset, Celia and Beverly have both donated substantial literary archives to the Southwestern Writers Collection. And one of the things about Beverly I found so fascinating is that she's talked about how she uses her dreams to help her revise her fiction, to just help her guide herself into the right areas and so forth. And she's captured a lot of these dreams in journals and so forth. And Celia, with the correspondence that she's turned over, just turning over these very private matters to a public institution where researchers can make use of them. We have other archives that are much more heavily sanitized, and so this is a real boon for researchers.
I don't know, maybe we should.
Okay, I've talked too long, I see. But in any case, I just think that's a wonderful thing that you guys have done in terms of ensuring your literary legacy in that way.
The person I live with now has said, "Not my letters." They don't go to that library.
We do have sealed correspondence, that's true. Do we have
You'd
other-
like them.
Yes.
I just was going to make a statement about courage in writing, and I write poetry, and I'm a high school English teacher. And courage in writing is when you stand in front of your class and share your own writing with them and invite them to make it better. Boy, are they ready to tell you. And it's a wonderful way to get them to write and not to feel so self-conscious, but that's real courage when I stand.
I agree.
I'm always not really, especially with my poetry, I'm just so picky. If I write prose, I know I'm not too swift, so that's okay.
Right.
But my poetry, I really love some pieces, and I'll think, okay, I'm going to share this with them. Oh, I don't know about that. I'm like, oh, that's courage.
You just reminded me of something, and that is that because I think the publishing industry, what it has become, and it's such a difficult business. The business of writing is one thing, but the business of publishing is quite another.
Yeah.
And it's become it's incredibly competitive, if not downright mean. The statistics are spellbinding. I don't know if people know this, but 90% of first novelists don't get a chance to write a second. Most books, in terms of readerships, most books that are published because of the way the publishing industry does business are, in a sense, flops. They're like movies. There are some big hits, but they're flops in terms of an audience, in terms of, there's a lot of great movies that nobody sees, but they're considered flops, box office flops. And so I think in the climate that we have today, that young people want to write and want to become writers does take a lot of courage. It really does, because, they're diving into a field that really used to be a lot nicer. It was always competitive, but now, it's quite a difficult field, and for someone to say, I want to be a writer and I want to pursue that. I want to pursue that and to be really serious about it. I think that takes a lot of courage, because it's going to be, I think it's a real struggle. It really is. I think, I think I've been very lucky in that respect, but I think it's very difficult. And, I never thought of myself courageous in that way, because I think I was just dumb. I left the priesthood. I think it took courage for me, that part of my life. And I didn't want to be a starving I always wanted to be an artist, and I didn't want to be a starving artist, so I became a writer, which makes no sense at all, and I should have known better, but I just kind of did it, and it really just worked out for me. But I think, today I see students. I have very gifted students. I have some very gifted students, and I really encourage them, and part of me says, God, Ben, what are you doing encouraging them to do this in this climate? But they're so good. They're so good, and I know it's going to be tough for them. And they don't live in New York. They live in El Paso, and and all of that stuff, which doesn't help because we there's not a lot of cultural capital. And where did you learn to write? El Paso, Texas. As opposed to somewhere else, unfortunately. And so I did want to say that because I think that there's young people out there that want to be writers. I think in order to do that with both of your eyes, with your eyes open, you have to dive into the water, knowing that, and not only knowing how to swim, but having a lot of courage.
Anybody else? Well, there are books for sale, courtesy of the University Bookstore, and our authors will be happy to sign them for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.